Story number 1.
The winter had come early that year, and Sarah wasn't prepared for it. She had made the trip up to her cabin in the woods alone, a solitary retreat to get away from the chaos of city life. The air was crisp as she arrived, and there was a thin layer of snow covering the ground. She had planned to stay for the weekend, but it seemed that the weather had other plans. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the first flakes began to fall. The snow came softly at first, like tiny whispers on the wind. But within an hour, the storm grew fierce, and the snow began to pile up quickly, coating everything in a thick blanket of white. Sarah peered out from her cabin's window, watching as the swirling storm swallowed the world outside. The trees, once visible, were now hidden in the storm's fury. She hadn't anticipated this kind of weather. The cabin was far from civilization, and the roads were treacherous in the best of conditions, let alone during a snowstorm. There was no way she'd be able to leave now, and no cell service to call for help even if she wanted to. The wind howled as it beat against the walls of the cabin. Inside, the warmth of the fire crackled in the hearth, a comfort as she wrapped herself in a thick blanket and settled into an old armchair. She was alone, and although she relished the solitude, something in the back of her mind told her that this storm felt different. It felt wrong. The storm raged through the night, the wind tearing at the trees and making eerie, low moaning sounds as if something were calling from deep within the forest. Sarah tried to ignore it, curling up with a book, but the persistent noise outside unsettled her. Every now and then she'd hear something beyond the howling wind, soft knocks, as if someone were tapping gently at the window. She stood up and walked to the glass. The storm made it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet, but there was nothing at the window, just snow swirling in the dim light of the cabin. She breathed a sigh of relief, shaking her head at her own nerves. The isolation was getting to her. With a deep breath, Sarah returned to her chair and resumed reading, trying to push away the sense of unease creeping over her. She was used to being alone, but the combination of the storm and the odd noises made her feel like she was being watched. Her mind played tricks in the dark, imagining shapes and figures in the corners of the cabin. Eventually, the storm's intensity began to ease. The wind slowed, and the snow seemed to settle. Sarah, exhausted from the long day and the unnerving events, let herself drift off to sleep by the fire. The warmth of the room wrapped around her, and she let herself relax, hoping that by morning everything would feel normal again. But when she awoke, something was wrong. The storm had passed and daylight streamed through the window. She stretched and glanced around the room, her eyes flicking over the familiar cabin. The fire had long since died down, leaving only the cold remnants of ashes in the hearth. It was then that she noticed it. The front door. It was wide open. Her heart skipped a beat, and she rushed over to the door, slamming it shut, her hands shaking. There was no reason for the door to be open. She hadn't gone outside during the night, and there was no indication that anyone else had entered the cabin. The storm had made it impossible for anyone to get through the snow without leaving obvious tracks. Sarah locked the door and leaned against it, trying to calm herself. Maybe she had forgotten to close it properly. Maybe the wind had blown it open. She tried to convince herself that it was just an accident, but deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. She checked the windows, the ones she had made sure were all securely shut the night before. They were all locked. No sign of forced entry. She stepped outside cautiously, her boots sinking into the deep snow. The world looked different in the daylight. The storm had left a pristine layer of snow covering everything, the trees weighed down with heavy branches. But even though the storm had passed, the air felt colder than it had the day before, and the silence pressed down on her, thick and heavy. Sarah looked around, trying to spot anything unusual. The woods were eerily still, the snow undisturbed except for her own tracks. No other footprints, no signs of life, nothing. She felt a shiver run down her spine. It was as though she was completely alone, even though she knew there was something out there, something watching her. She turned back to the cabin, but as she did, she saw something on the ground by the door. A footprint. But not a normal footprint. It was strange, uneven, as if something had been dragging itself through the snow. Her breath caught in her throat. She knelt down to get a better look. The print was deep, the outline jagged. It didn't look like a human foot, but more like a dragging motion, as if something had been crawling, and the snow around it was disturbed, as if whatever had made it had struggled. Her mind raced. Was it an animal, or something worse? She didn't want to think about it. She wanted to run, to leave, but the storm had left her stranded. She was stuck. Suddenly, a loud noise came from behind her, a sharp, guttural sound that sent a spike of fear through her chest. Sarah whipped around, her heart racing. But there was nothing, only the forest. The trees swayed slightly in the breeze, and the snow crunched under her feet. Still, that feeling lingered, the sense that something was there, something not quite right. She hurried back inside the cabin, locking the door behind her once again. Her hands were shaking, and her mind was clouded with panic. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being hunted. The day passed slowly. Sarah stayed inside, her nerves on edge, unable to shake the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin. The noise outside had stopped, but she couldn't help but feel the weight of something watching her. Every creak of the cabin seemed to echo in her mind. Every shift in the snow outside made her jump. As night fell again, the temperature dropped rapidly. Sarah tried to make dinner, but she couldn't focus. She kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see something moving outside. But nothing. The night was still, quiet, and cold. Just as she sat down to eat, a knock echoed through the cabin. A sharp, hollow sound like someone tapping at the door. Her heart froze in her chest. She froze, listening. The knock came again, louder this time. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She hadn't seen a soul since she arrived. The door, the knock. She felt a cold sweat break out on her skin as she slowly stood up. The fire crackled softly in the corner, but all she could hear now was the blood rushing in her ears. Slowly, she approached the door. She didn't want to open it, but she had to. She had to know. With trembling hands, she reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door swung open easily, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A woman, tall, pale, with hollow eyes and tattered clothing. Her face was gaunt, her skin a sickly white. The woman looked at Sarah with an expression that seemed to pierce through her. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice raspy, as cold as the wind outside. "Please." Sarah froze, staring at the woman. Her eyes were wide with terror, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm had returned, the wind howling again, swirling around them in a frenzy. But there was something else. Something Sarah could not quite place. The woman wasn't moving, her feet rooted to the spot, and the longer Sarah looked at her, the more unnatural her presence seemed. And then, as suddenly as the woman had appeared, she was gone. Vanished. Disappeared into the wind, leaving no trace behind. Sarah slammed the door shut, her heart pounding. She backed away, stumbling, terrified. The fire sputtered in the hearth, casting shadows across the cabin. The storm raged outside, but now Sarah knew she wasn't alone. She could feel it. She could feel the presence, the eyes watching her, waiting. As the storm outside grew more intense, Sarah knew one thing for certain. The night was far from over.
Story number 2.
The wind howled like a living thing as it whistled through the trees, battering the old cabin I had rented for the weekend. The snowstorm had come in quick, earlier than the weather reports had predicted. Now, just hours into the blizzard, the world outside was nothing but a blank sheet of white, and the darkness of night had only made it worse. The howling wind pressed against the cabin's thin walls, shaking the windows in their frames. I had come up to the remote cabin in the mountains to get away from the chaos of the city for a few days, to find some peace and solitude. It had been a long time since I had experienced true isolation, the kind of silence that only the wilderness could provide. The cabin was small but cozy, a single room with a wood-burning stove, a simple kitchen, and a large, sagging couch by the window. The owner had warned me that during storms like this, the power could go out, and they had left a few candles and lanterns for such an occasion. As the wind howled outside, I lit a few candles, feeling the warmth of the flickering flame ease the cold tension in my shoulders. The storm outside was growing stronger, and I was glad to be indoors. I had a book to read and a hot drink to sip. It seemed like the perfect evening. That is, until I heard it. A knock. It was faint at first, the sound coming from the front door, just beneath the shrill wind. I looked over the door, unsure if I had heard it at all. The wind was so loud that it almost seemed like it was coming from inside my own head. But then, there it was again, a knock. A soft but deliberate rapping against the wood. I hesitated. Who would be out there in a storm like this? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the cabin was situated on a stretch of road that was seldom traveled during the winter months. I hadn't seen another vehicle in hours. I rose slowly from my seat, walking toward the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice unnervingly loud in the silence of the cabin. There was no response. The knock came again, this time louder, as though whoever was out there was growing impatient. I unlocked the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The storm had completely obscured the view through the small window, but I felt a sense of foreboding settle over me. I opened the door, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one. The snow had piled high against the porch, the wind scattering it in every direction, but there was no figure standing at the threshold. Just the storm, the howling wind, and the thick, swirling snow that swallowed up everything beyond. Confused, I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the yard. The snow had buried everything, trees, shrubs, and the distant outline of the forest beyond. No sign of life. The silence was deafening. I stood there for a moment longer, my heart thumping in my chest. It could have been an animal, a stray dog, or some other creature seeking shelter from the storm. I told myself that as I shut the door and turned the lock, but the feeling that something was wrong gnawed at me. Something wasn't right. I tried to shake it off, retreating back into the cabin. I lit another lantern and set it on the small table beside the couch. But as I sat back down, a strange sense of being watched came over me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and the quiet was thick with an eerie weight. I couldn't explain it, but the atmosphere felt different now, like the house had shifted somehow. I glanced at the clock. It was barely 8 p.m., but the storm made it feel like the dead of night. The hours stretched out before me, thick and slow, with nothing to do but wait for the storm to pass. I stared out the window, watching the snow fall in heavy sheets, listening to the wind tear through the trees. And then I heard it again, a knock. This time it came from inside the house. My heart lurched. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to convince myself that it was the house settling, the creaking of old wood in the storm. But the knock repeated, and then another, followed by a series of rapid, insistent raps against the walls. The noise echoed through the cabin, seeming to come from every direction at once. I rushed to the nearest window, pulling back the curtain, but the storm outside was as fierce as ever, and nothing could be seen beyond the glass. No one was standing out there. No one was close enough to be knocking on the walls. Panic surged in my chest. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. The knocking wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I grabbed my phone, but the screen was blank. No service. Of course, I thought the storm had taken out the signal. I shoved it back into my pocket, trying to calm my breathing. The wind had died down, and the snowstorm seemed quieter now. But the silence inside the cabin was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and every shadow in the room seemed to shift as though it were alive. I turned toward the back of the cabin, my gaze falling on the small hallway that led to the bathroom and the bedroom. The door to the bathroom was ajar, and I noticed that the light was flickering, casting strange shadows across the walls. I didn't remember leaving the light on. I approached the hallway slowly, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. My breath felt tight in my chest. When I reached the bathroom door, I pushed it open, but the room was empty. Nothing was out of place. But then I heard a sound, soft and almost imperceptible, a low, whispering breath, as though someone was standing behind me. I whirled around, my heart hammering, but the hallway was empty. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. I could see my breath fogging in the air, a dense chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. The house had been warm when I entered, but now it felt like the winter had crept inside. I rushed to the living room, grabbing a blanket off the couch and wrapping it around my shoulders, trying to fight off the creeping cold. The wind began to howl again, louder now, rattling the windows as if the storm were trying to force its way inside. The knocking resumed, and it was louder this time, more forceful, as if something were pounding against the walls with its fists. It came from behind me, just outside the living room. The sound was unmistakable, and it was getting closer. I spun around to face the source, but the cabin remained still. No one was there. The walls were silent, but then I heard it, a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, like a whisper directly in my ear. Go. Leave. I froze, my heart in my throat. I turned, but there was no one behind me. The voice had come from nowhere, yet I knew it had been real. It hadn't been the wind, it hadn't been the storm. Something or someone was here with me. I don't remember what happened next. All I knew was the overwhelming sense of dread that filled every corner of the cabin. I grabbed my coat, threw open the front door, and ran. The snowstorm had calmed, the wind now reduced to a distant murmur. But the chill inside me didn't fade. I didn't stop running until I reached the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the nearest town and found a place to stay for the night, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a trick of the mind, the isolation and the storm playing games with my senses. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that something was in that cabin with me, that night, waiting. And I'll never go back to that cabin again. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I had always been fond of winter, the serenity of the snowfall, the crispness in the air. The little cabin I had rented for the weekend was nestled deep in the forest, far from the city lights and distractions. It was a perfect retreat. I thought it would be peaceful, an escape from the overwhelming noise of daily life. I never expected it to turn into something far more sinister. The storm started in the late afternoon. At first, it was just a few flurries, the kind of snow that floats gently to the ground before fading into the wind. I watched from the large front window as the flakes began to fall faster, swirling in the gusts of wind. I wasn't worried. I had seen plenty of snowstorms before and knew they often passed as quickly as they came. I still had a fire going in the hearth and a cup of hot chocolate beside me. I was comfortable, cozy. But by evening, the snow had transformed into something far more violent. The wind howled as it swept through the trees, shaking the cabin's wooden walls. The snow didn't fall gently anymore. It came down in thick, heavy sheets, battering against the windows. I could hear the whistling sound of the wind as it seemed to circle the cabin, pressing against the walls as though something was trying to get inside. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the storm was too loud, too insistent. Every now and then, I thought I could hear something outside, an odd scraping sound, like fingers dragging across the wooden exterior. I told myself it was just the wind, but a small, uneasy knot began to form in my stomach. When the power went out, I wasn't too concerned at first. It wasn't uncommon for the storm to knock out the electricity. I lit a few candles and settled back down by the fire, trying to focus on the warmth and the flickering light. But the longer the storm raged, the more oppressive the silence felt. The wind outside had become almost deafening, and the occasional scraping noise intensified. It sounded too rhythmic, almost deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to get in. I tried to push the thought from my mind, blaming it on my nerves, but the anxiety was growing. The storm was picking up speed, and I felt increasingly isolated. The thought of venturing outside, even to check the storm's progress, was out of the question. There was no telling how deep the snow had gotten, or if I could even make it back to the main road. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but at some point I must have dozed off in my chair. When I woke up, the cabin was eerily still, save for the soft crackle of the fire. I glanced around, a feeling of unease settling deeper in my chest. It was late, too late for me to still be awake, or at least that's what my tired mind told me. The wind had calmed, and the snow outside was no longer falling in the violent bursts it had earlier. The storm had settled into a soft, steady rhythm. But there was something else. A shadow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the dancing flames in the hearth cast strange shapes across the room. But no, the shadow was too defined, too real. It seemed to be moving just outside the window, growing larger as it approached. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was unmistakable. There was someone out there, someone standing just outside, just beyond the glass. I stood up quickly, knocking over the chair in my haste. I scrambled to the window, trying to see better through the frosted glass, but the shadows were too thick. The storm had cleared the snow somewhat from the glass, but it was still hard to make anything out. The shape outside was vague, but I could still see movement, slow, deliberate steps in the snow. I held my breath, unsure of what to do. Then the knock came. It was soft at first, almost like a tapping sound against the window. I pressed my forehead to the glass, squinting to make out any details. The figure outside was closer now, closer than before. I could see it more clearly, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. It was a woman. Her clothes were ragged, torn in places, and she was covered in snow. But it wasn't her appearance that sent a wave of terror through me. It was the way she was staring at me. Her eyes were wide and empty, the pupils completely black, as if her eyes were hollowed out. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Then came a voice, soft but audible, barely a whisper. "Let me in." I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. My hand reached for the door lock, then hesitated. What was I supposed to do? Who was this woman? And why was she out there in the storm? A desperate part of me wanted to help, but a stronger instinct told me that something was wrong. I couldn't explain why, but I knew it was safer to stay away. I backed away from the door, retreating into the shadows of the cabin. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I was just imagining things. The storm was playing tricks on me, twisting my mind. The woman had to be a figment of my imagination, right? But the knocking didn't stop. It was getting louder, more frantic. I grabbed my phone, but it was dead. No surprise there. I had been trying to conserve the battery all day. My thoughts raced, my body trembling. I had to get out of here. I had to leave. I tried to open the front door, but the handle wouldn't budge. The wind must have blown it shut. Frantically, I pulled at the door, but it was stuck. I turned to the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking had stopped, but the tension in the air was thick, as though something was waiting. I reached the back door and managed to force it open. A rush of cold air blasted into the cabin, freezing the room. But as soon as I stepped outside, my foot sank deep into the snow. I looked up and gasped. The woman stood at the edge of the trees, her figure barely visible against the white backdrop of the snowstorm. But she wasn't just standing there. She was staring at me. Her face twisted in an expression I couldn't quite comprehend. It was a mixture of pleading and rage, her mouth opening slightly as though to say something more. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. My legs burned as I pushed through the deep snow, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. I didn't care where I was going. I just had to get away from her. The wind howled around me, biting into my skin, but I kept running. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I collapsed, exhausted, beside a large tree. My lungs burned from the cold, and my legs felt like they might give way at any moment. It wasn't until I stopped that I realized the storm had started up again, and this time the wind was even stronger. And then I heard it. The voice. Soft. Almost too faint to hear, but unmistakable. "Why didn't you let me in?" I froze, my heart thumping painfully in my chest. I could feel it, the presence. The woman was out there, somewhere, in the storm. I didn't dare move. The storm raged through the night, but I didn't return to the cabin. I couldn't. I waited, huddled against the tree until the morning light finally broke through the storm. When I made my way back to the cabin, I found it empty. The door was wide open. Snow had drifted in, covering the floor and the furniture as though someone had been there recently, but there was no sign of her. I left that day without looking back. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? The storm, the figure, the voice. It didn't make sense. I never went back to that cabin again. And to this day, I can't help but wonder if that woman is still out there, waiting in the snowstorm for someone to let her in. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The night the snowstorm hit was the kind of storm people around here always talked about in hushed voices, the kind that brought the town to a standstill, buried in snow for days. I had lived in the area for most of my life and had seen my fair share of winter storms, but nothing prepared me for the one that arrived late in the evening that January. The sky had been clear all day, but by dusk the wind started to pick up and the temperature plummeted. The forecast had warned of a storm, but no one expected it to be this fierce. I had been living in my family's old cabin in the woods for the past few months, trying to get some space after a difficult breakup. It wasn't much, just a small two-story place nestled in the trees about 6 miles outside of town. But it had always been a place of comfort for me. My parents had passed away years ago, and I had inherited the cabin, though I rarely came out here after they'd gone. Something about the place had always made me uneasy, especially during the winter months. I was sitting by the fire reading a book and sipping on tea when I first heard the wind pick up. It was the kind of wind that made the house groan, and I could hear the snow hitting the windows in a constant tap, tap, tap. The storm was growing stronger by the minute, and I knew it was going to be bad. I didn't mind, though. I had planned to spend the weekend inside, away from the world. The isolation was part of the appeal. There was just one problem: the road. The cabin was located on a secluded stretch of highway, and when the snow piled up, it was impossible to get out. The storm was so intense that by 8 p.m. I knew it was too dangerous to drive. I decided to stay in for the night and wait until the storm passed. At around midnight, the storm had intensified to an eerie level. The wind was screaming outside, and I could hear the occasional cracking of trees in the distance. I was lying in bed, listening to the blizzard rage against the house, when I heard it. A faint knock. It came from downstairs, just outside my bedroom door. Quiet at first, then louder, more deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. My heart skipped a beat as I lay there, frozen, listening. The house had been empty since my parents passed away, and there was no reason for anyone to be knocking at my door at this hour. I figured it was just the wind or the house settling, but the sound persisted. Knock, knock, knock. I hesitated for a long time, too afraid to move. I hadn't heard anyone approach the house, and the road was buried under several feet of snow by now. No one should have been out there. Finally, I mustered the courage to get up and check. I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and stepped out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor. The knock had stopped, and the house was once again silent, save for the howling wind outside. I walked cautiously down the narrow hallway, the old wood creaking under my weight. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped. The front door stood ajar, though I was certain I had closed it earlier. A sharp gust of wind blew through the crack in the door, sending a chill down my spine. I felt a strange, oppressive weight in the air, like something was wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I turned the doorknob slowly, pushing the door open. There was no one there, just the snow and the howling wind. The porch light was on, casting long shadows across the snow, but no footprints led up to the door. I stepped outside, scanning the yard for any sign of movement, but it was empty. I was alone. The snowstorm raged around me, the wind cutting through my jacket as if it were nothing more than paper. I closed the door and locked it behind me, though the unease in my chest refused to go away. The knock had felt wrong, but I chalked it up to the storm, the isolation, and my overactive imagination. I tried to ignore the feeling and went back upstairs to bed. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The wind seemed louder now, almost like voices calling through the storm. I turned over, trying to drift off to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw something in my mind's eye. A shadow. A figure standing just outside the window. I sat up, heart racing, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the snow, just beyond the glass, was a person. They were tall, draped in a long, dark coat, their face obscured by the hood. They stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something. I froze, unable to move, watching them from the safety of my bed. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me, waiting for me to do something. The wind howled, the storm growing more violent by the second. I could see the figure in the reflection of the window, standing perfectly still, their body just barely visible through the falling snow. I don't know how long I stared at them. It felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. Finally, the figure turned slowly, its movements almost too deliberate, as if it were aware I was watching. It started to walk away slowly, moving out of sight behind a large oak tree that stood near the edge of the yard. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for a moment, I considered going outside to check. But something in my gut told me it was a terrible idea. I stayed in my bed, staring out into the storm, wondering if I had imagined it. But no, there was no mistaking what I had seen. A figure standing in the snow, in the middle of the worst storm I had ever witnessed. I don't know how long I stayed awake that night. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind never letting up. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me and I fell into a restless sleep, but even in my dreams, I felt the weight of that figure watching me, waiting. When morning came, the storm had passed. The sky was clear, but the damage had been done. The world outside was buried under several feet of snow, and the roads were impassable. I went downstairs hoping to find some sign of the figure from the night before, some trace that they had actually been there. But the yard was empty. The porch was untouched. No footprints in the snow. I stood at the window, staring out into the winter landscape, and that's when I saw it. A single set of footprints leading from the woods at the edge of my property, across the yard and stopping right at the door. But there was no sign of anyone. The footprints simply vanished into the storm, as though the person had never been there at all. I never stayed in that cabin again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home that night, something that was still out there, waiting in the snow.
Story number 5.
It was the cold that first struck me. I had driven through the snowstorm for what seemed like hours before I finally reached the old inn, tucked away in a quiet valley far from any town. The kind of place people who wanted to be alone went. It had been a long journey, and I was grateful to finally see the lights glowing faintly from the windows. The wind howled outside, and the snow was coming down in thick sheets, making it nearly impossible to see the road in front of me. I pulled up to the inn, a large old building with thick stone walls and a creaky wooden sign swinging in the wind. The door opened before I even reached the porch, and the innkeeper, a middle-aged man with a graying beard, stepped out to greet me. "You made it through the storm, then?" he asked, his voice rough from the cold. I nodded, trying to shake the snow off my jacket. "Yes, but barely." "You're lucky you got here when you did," he said, giving me a warm smile. "The storm's only getting worse. Come on in, get out of the cold." He led me inside, where the warmth from a roaring fire filled the room. The inn was small but cozy, with old wooden beams across the ceiling and dark, worn furniture. The scent of wood smoke and something sweet, maybe cinnamon, lingered in the air. I took a deep breath, relieved to be out of the storm. "Thank you," I said, rubbing my hands together. "It's freezing out there." He chuckled softly. "That's winter for you. Never trust a snowstorm, though. You don't know what it might bring." I frowned slightly, not sure what he meant by that. He went on to explain the rooms and handed me a key. "You'll be in the room at the end of the hall. It's the quietest place to stay, especially on nights like this." I took the key and thanked him, heading up the stairs with my bag. The hallway was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few flickering candles along the walls. The floor creaked under my footsteps as I reached the last door at the end of the hall. When I stepped inside, I felt immediately at ease. The room was simple, with an antique bed, a small writing desk, and a fireplace. Snow could be seen falling heavily through the window, the world outside obscured by the swirling wind. I closed the door behind me and set my bag on the bed, still not fully used to the silence. The inn seemed empty. There were no other guests, or at least none I had seen, just the innkeeper who had left me to my solitude. For a while, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The storm outside intensified, the wind pressing against the windows with increasing ferocity. I had planned to relax and read for a while before bed, but something about the place began to unsettle me. It wasn't the building itself, there was something about the silence, the stillness of the night. The wind howling outside seemed to press in against the walls, as though it were trying to force its way inside. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I began to hear it. A soft sound. A tapping, almost like a knock on the window. I stood up, walking over to the window to see if anyone was outside, but the snow was too thick, the visibility too poor. The tapping continued, faint but persistent, almost like a whisper in the storm. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or the trees scraping against the building. I went back to the fire, attempting to shake off the unease creeping into my thoughts. That's when I heard it more clearly. A voice. It was low, but unmistakable. A soft, breathless whisper, barely audible over the storm. "Help me." I froze. The room seemed to get colder, the warmth from the fire not as comforting as it had been moments ago. I turned slowly, looking around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. Nothing. Just the quiet flickering of the fire and the storm outside. I told myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. But then it came again, louder this time. Help me. It was coming from the window. I walked over cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there for a moment, staring at the glass, half expecting something or someone to be standing just beyond the storm, their face pressed against the cold pane. But nothing. No figure, no shape, just the darkness and the snow. The tapping started again, harder now, almost like a knock. I couldn't take it any longer. I swung open the window, the cold wind rushing inside, and peered out into the storm. The snow was swirling around me, blinding and thick. I saw nothing, not even the outline of a figure, just endless white. Is someone out there? I shouted over the wind. Can you hear me? No answer. The tapping stopped. But then the voice came again, so close now I could almost feel it against my ear. Help me. I slammed the window shut, my hands trembling. What in the world was going on? I backed away from the window, looking around the room as if expecting the source of the voice to suddenly appear. My breath came in ragged gasps. I was terrified, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt trapped. I hurried to the door, threw it open, and rushed out into the hallway. It was completely silent now. The only sounds were the echoes of my own footsteps. I ran downstairs, hoping to find the innkeeper. Maybe he could explain what was happening, what I had heard. But the place was empty. The fire in the main room still burned, casting long shadows on the walls, but there was no sign of the innkeeper anywhere. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't place. I stepped forward cautiously, my mind racing. The storm outside was growing even fiercer. It seemed to be pressing in on the building, the wind howling like a living thing. I turned back toward the stairs, intending to return to my room, but that's when I saw it. A figure. It was standing at the top of the stairs, just at the edge of the shadow. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was a woman, standing still and silent, staring down at me from the darkness. Her clothes were tattered, covered in snow. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes were wide and hollow, empty black pits, her expression vacant. Her skin was pale, almost lifeless, like the snow that had been piling up outside. "Help me," she whispered, her voice rasping like the wind. I didn't wait for her to speak again. I turned and bolted for the door, tearing it open and stepping back into the storm without looking back. The wind hit me with full force, nearly knocking me off my feet. I had no idea where I was running, no idea what I was doing. I just had to get away. The world was a blur of white, the snow so thick I could barely see my own hands in front of me. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I don't remember how long I ran through the storm, but eventually I collapsed in the snow, too exhausted to move. The wind howled around me, but there was no sign of the woman, no trace of the voice. Eventually the storm passed. The wind died down and the snow turned from a blinding flurry into a soft, steady fall. The world was quiet, still. When I finally made my way back to the inn, it was empty. The doors were locked, and the lights were off. The innkeeper was gone. The fire had burned out in the main room, leaving only ash. I never found out what happened that night. I left the inn as quickly as I could, and I never returned. Sometimes when the snow falls heavily, I still hear that voice in the wind, calling to me, begging me to help. But I know better now. Some things are better left untouched. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
It was the winter of 2015 when I moved into the small cabin in the woods. The house was in a remote area of Vermont, surrounded by snow-covered pines and a long stretch of unpaved road. It was an old place, built in the 1800s, passed down through generations, and had a history that the previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Tuttle, rarely discussed. The only thing she ever said about it was, "Some things are better left undisturbed." I had been seeking a fresh start, tired of the city's chaos, looking for solitude in nature. I didn't mind the isolation at first, especially when the winter snow began to fall heavily in December, transforming the surrounding forest into a peaceful, frosty wonderland. The house was small but comfortable, with a crackling fireplace that warmed the rooms and a thick woolen blanket on the couch that made the evenings feel inviting despite the bitter cold outside. The first week was uneventful. The cabin creaked with the wind and the snow piled up against the windows, but there was nothing unusual about it. I spent my days reading by the fire and my nights watching the flames flicker. It was quiet, too quiet sometimes, but I welcomed the silence. That was until the storm came. It began in the late afternoon, with a gust of wind and a few flurries. I hadn't expected the weather to turn so quickly. The forecast had been clear, but the storm arrived in waves, fast and relentless. By nightfall, the wind was howling, and the snow had begun to fall heavily, swirling in blinding sheets. The world outside vanished under a blanket of white, and the house seemed to groan under the pressure of the storm. I had lit a fire in the hearth and wrapped myself in a blanket, watching the snow from the window when I heard it, the knock. At first, I thought it was the wind. The house was old, and it had a way of settling, creaking in the cold, but then it came again. A sharp knock on the front door, followed by another, then another, as if someone were standing outside in the snowstorm, waiting. I froze. The cabin was isolated, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. No one would be out here in such a storm. I pushed the thought from my mind and tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but the knocking continued, persistent, rhythmic. Each knock was louder than the last until I could hear nothing else but that sound. I stood slowly, my feet cold against the hardwood floor, and made my way to the door. I hesitated before reaching for the knob. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. No one would be brave or foolish enough to be caught in the middle of such a storm. And yet, I could hear it still, growing louder, as though whoever was knocking was trying to get my attention. I opened the door, my breath catching in my throat, but the cold night air and the howling wind greeted me. There was nothing there. The snow whipped in every direction, and the porch was empty, save for the drifts that had accumulated. I closed the door and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was nothing. The storm had likely played tricks on my mind. I tried to ignore the sinking feeling that something was wrong, but the knocking did not stop. It was as if the knocking was coming from within the walls themselves. A steady thumping, faint but unmistakable, as though someone was pounding their fists against the timber. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the house reacting to the storm, but as the night went on, the sound grew more distinct, almost frantic, as if it were a warning. I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight, the beam trembling in my hand, and walked through the dark hallway. The sound was louder now, echoing down the narrow corridors. I approached the walls, my flashlight illuminating the peeling wallpaper. It was coming from behind the wooden panels, beneath the floorboards. I stood still, listening to the sound of desperate knocking. I didn't understand it. The house was empty, and yet it felt as though someone, or something, was trapped inside. I returned to the living room, trying to calm myself. The storm outside raged on, but the knocking had stopped for the moment. I thought about calling the police, but the nearest town was a good hour away, and in this storm, help would take forever to arrive. I decided to stay put, hoping the knocking would stop. But as the night wore on, I began to feel a presence. It wasn't just the eerie sounds coming from the walls or the unsettling silence that seemed to follow me from room to room. There was something else, something tangible. The air grew heavier, colder. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. I was curled up on the couch, trying to ignore the deep sense of dread that had settled over me when I heard it again. A voice. At first, it was soft, almost a whisper, as if someone were standing just beyond the door. I held my breath, straining to hear. The voice grew clearer, more distinct, calling my name in a low, mournful tone. Elena, Elena. I froze, paralyzed by fear. The voice was chilling, and I had no idea where it was coming from. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the storm. It was real. I stood up slowly, clutching the flashlight, and moved toward the door. The voice came again, louder this time. It sounded desperate, as if it were calling for help. I flung open the door, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The snowstorm raged outside, but there was no one there. The yard was empty. The yard was out, but then out. A figure standing just beyond the porch, half hidden by the swirling snow. A silhouette of a person, wrapped in a dark cloak, their face obscured by the hood. They stood motionless, as if waiting for something. I couldn't move. I wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stared at me, and I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking. And then, with a sudden gust of wind, the figure vanished, disappearing into the storm as if it had never been there at all. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. I couldn't explain what had just happened. I didn't know if I had seen a person or if it had been a hallucination brought on by the storm and my growing fear. But something about it felt real, more real than the storm itself. The rest of the night was a blur of restless sleep and strange noises. The knocking continued sporadically throughout the night, but no one ever came to the door. In the morning, the storm had passed and the world outside was blanketed in white. The trees, heavy with snow, looked like silent sentinels watching over the cabin. I never stayed another night in that cabin. I left early the next morning, leaving everything behind. I tried to explain away what happened, but I couldn't. I never went back to that place, and I never will. There are some things, some places that are better left untouched. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The wind howled through the trees, a bitter, unrelenting force that shook the old wooden house. The snowstorm outside had been raging for hours, and I could see no end in sight. The power had gone out earlier in the evening, leaving me alone in the dark with nothing but the sound of the storm for company. The only light came from the flickering fireplace in the living room, casting long shadows across the walls. I had rented this old cabin for a quiet weekend away from the noise of the city. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to relax and escape. But now, as the wind screamed through the cracks in the walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house had always been a little odd. The innkeeper, a woman named Margaret, had warned me about it when I checked in. "It's an old place," she'd said, her voice low and a little hesitant. "A bit creaky, but it's safe, don't worry." Safe, I thought, but I wasn't so sure anymore. It wasn't the house that unnerved me, not exactly. It was the strange noises I'd been hearing all evening, tapping sounds like someone was knocking on the windows or the walls. I had tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind, but the tapping was different, deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. I got up from the couch, the fire crackling as I walked across the room to the window. Snow was falling in thick sheets, the ground outside buried beneath a blanket of white. I looked out into the dark, trying to make sense of the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the storm. The tapping came again, louder this time. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was coming from the window, just beside me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and pressed my face against the cold glass. Nothing. I pulled back, my mind racing. The tapping had stopped. I turned around, my back to the window, but then I heard it again, soft and quick, almost like a whisper. "Help me." My blood ran cold. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It was coming from the dark hallway behind me. I turned sharply, expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty, just the shadows cast by the flickering firelight. I told myself it was just the wind again, playing tricks on my mind. But the voice persisted, growing louder, clearer. "Help me." I couldn't breathe. My legs felt weak beneath me as I stumbled toward the hallway. The voice was coming from somewhere deep in the house, distant, yet so close. I stood frozen at the doorway, my hands trembling. The house was silent now, the storm outside the only sound. I moved cautiously, step by step, my heart hammering in my chest. The air in the hallway was cold, colder than the rest of the house now, as though the storm had crept inside. I reached the stairs at the end of the hall, and that's when I heard it. A door creaked open. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes wide with terror. The sound was coming from upstairs, from one of the bedrooms. I was alone. I had checked every room when I arrived, making sure the house was empty. There was no one else here. But now there was a sound. Someone was moving around upstairs. The voice came again, closer this time, like it was right behind me. "Help me." I spun around, my mind a whirl of panic. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, like something was moving just beyond my sight. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, my body frozen in place by fear. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. It was as if the house was closing in on me. The wind outside screamed louder, the storm intensifying once more. The snow was falling harder than ever, and I knew I couldn't leave. The snowstorm had trapped me here, and whatever was in this house wasn't going to let me go. I backed away from the stairs, my eyes glued to the darkness above. The tapping began again, this time coming from every direction at once, as if the entire house was alive with it. The voice whispered again, faint but clear. "Help me, please." I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the door at the far end of the hall, my hands shaking as I tried to turn the handle, but the door wouldn't open. I pulled harder, panic rising in my chest. The tapping grew louder, the whispers becoming frenzied, desperate. "Help me, please. I need you." The door suddenly flew open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. My eyes shot to the figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, her dark hair matted and wet with snow. Her eyes were wide and hollow, empty black pits that seemed to stare right through me. She stood there, silent, her thin, trembling body swaying slightly as though she were struggling to stay upright. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice hoarse and broken. I couldn't move. My body felt like lead, like I was paralyzed by the terror coursing through me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The air around me was thick with cold, as though the room itself had frozen solid. The woman stepped forward, her bare feet making no sound on the floor. She reached out a hand toward me, her fingers long and skeletal, her skin pale and cracked. "Help me, please." I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The cold from the storm outside had seeped into my bones, and I could feel the chill of her presence, icy and unnatural. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the house had a hold on me, trapping me here with this thing, this ghost. The woman took another step forward, her breath coming in slow, ragged gasps. I could feel her presence pressing against me, suffocating me. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the horror, but when I opened them again, she was gone. The hallway was empty. The door was wide open, the storm still raging outside, but there was no sign of the woman. I ran downstairs, not stopping until I reached the front door. My hands fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled with all my strength, but it was locked. I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but there was no sound from the other side. The whispers began again, faint but growing louder. "Help me." The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, the storm outside swirling with the fury of 1,000 ghosts. I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, trying to fight against the invisible force that held me captive in this house. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the house was silent. The storm outside had stopped, the wind had died down, and the snow was no longer falling. The house, once so cold, was now warm again. The fire in the living room had started up again, crackling softly. I stood there, trembling, my mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woman, the whispers, the tapping, it couldn't have been real. It had to be a trick of the mind, the storm playing with my senses. But as I turned back toward the hallway, I saw it. The door to the upstairs bedroom was slightly ajar, the same door that had creaked open earlier. And in the darkness beyond it, I saw her, standing there, waiting. "Help me." I bolted for the door, ignoring the voice, ignoring the fear that threatened to overtake me. I ran into the night, into the storm, not stopping until I reached the road and found a car to take me far, far away from that place. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees and the snow falls in thick, swirling flakes, I can still hear her voice, "Help me." And I know deep down that I'll never escape it. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The first time I noticed something was off was during the winter of 2011. I had recently moved to a small town in the Adirondacks after a painful breakup. I had been hoping for peace and quiet, a break from the noise of the city, and thought that this cabin, tucked away in the woods, would offer me exactly that. It was the perfect place, isolated, with snow-covered pines surrounding it, and the only sounds were the howling winds in the trees and the occasional creak of the house settling. The cabin was old, built in the 1920s, and had been passed down through generations of the previous owner's family. The realtor had warned me that the house needed a bit of work, but I didn't mind. I didn't need much. A warm fire in the hearth and a few quiet nights were all I was after. The house was drafty, and the windows rattled in the wind, but those little quirks felt cozy, part of its charm. In the first few weeks, everything felt just as I'd expected. Peaceful, slow-paced. The The worst part of it was the isolation, but I had come to expect that. The nearest neighbor was a mile down the road, and the nearest town was about 10 miles away. Winter made everything feel even more isolated. The snow piled up fast, and soon the driveway became impassable without a shovel. I didn't mind. It gave me an excuse to stay inside. Then came the snowstorm. It was just after Christmas when the storm started. The forecast predicted a normal snowstorm, nothing out of the ordinary. But the winds picked up far quicker than expected, and by the time night fell, the storm had grown fierce. The snow whipped across the trees and the wind howled, rattling the windows and making the house feel like it might give way to the storm. I had planned to read by the fire and enjoy the quiet, but the weather made everything feel so tense. By 10 p.m., the storm had reached its peak. The temperature had dropped so low that I could feel the cold creeping through the walls, despite the fire in the living room. I bundled up, wrapped myself in a blanket, and curled up in front of the hearth, trying to relax. But then, just as I thought I might finally drift off, I heard it. A loud thump. It came from upstairs, directly above me. I froze, staring up at the ceiling. It wasn't the house settling. This sound was too deliberate, too heavy. I pushed the thought aside, thinking it was just the wind or the snow against the roof. But then it came again. Thump, thump. Someone or something was walking up there. I stood up and grabbed the flashlight from the nearby table, my heart pounding in my chest. I had checked the house before settling in for the night, and it was empty. There was no one else here. But there it was again, louder this time, as if whatever was up there was moving across the floor with purpose. I crept up the narrow staircase, my breath quickening with every step. The house creaked under my weight, and the sound of the storm outside seemed to grow even louder. I reached the top of the stairs and slowly made my way down the hallway. The knocking had stopped, but I could still hear the faint sound of something shifting. Footsteps, almost like someone was pacing back and forth in the room at the end of the hall. I reached the door to the attic. The sound seemed to be coming from there. I turned the knob slowly, and the door creaked open. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the flashlight in my hand. The room smelled old, musty, as if it hadn't been touched in years. There was nothing up there, just old furniture covered in dusty sheets and boxes stacked against the walls. But then, I noticed something strange. One of the boxes had been moved. It was positioned in the center of the room, facing the window. I hadn't touched it, and I was certain it hadn't been there when I'd last looked. I walked closer, my footsteps muffled by the thick dust on the floor, and saw that the box had been opened. Inside, there was only a single object, a small, old-fashioned music box with intricate carvings on its surface. I reached out and picked it up, my fingers brushing over the cool, worn wood. It looked ancient, like something that belonged to a different time. I turned the key and waited for the familiar melody, but nothing happened. The box remained silent, cold to the touch. It felt wrong, though, like there was something not quite right about it. As I stood there, still holding the box, I felt a chill creep over me. The air in the attic had grown suddenly cold, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned, ready to leave, but then I heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps behind me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. I wasn't alone. I rushed down the stairs, my mind racing, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But as I descended, the door to the living room creaked open on its own. The wind, the storm, I couldn't explain it. But as I entered the living room, the fire in the hearth flickered, casting long shadows across the room. I looked at the door again, my heart skipping a beat, but there was nothing there. I quickly locked the door and tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. The storm continued to rage outside, but the house felt unnervingly still. I had never been so aware of the silence, so aware of the space around me. But it wasn't until the next morning that the full weight of what happened hit me. When I woke up, the storm had passed. The sun was out, but the snow outside was thick, covering the ground in a pristine layer of white. I decided to head outside to check the driveway, to see if I could shovel a path to the road. But when I opened the front door, I was taken aback. There were footprints in the snow, footprints that weren't there the night before. The prints were fresh, their edges sharp against the untouched snow, leading from the woods behind the house to the porch. They were small, as if made by boots much too old, and they stopped right at the doorstep. I stared at them for a long time, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Who could have come here in the middle of the night, especially during such a brutal storm? And why had they left no trace when they turned around to leave? The rest of the day was uneventful, but that night the storm seemed to return. The wind picked up again, and the house creaked under the pressure. I didn't sleep much, constantly feeling the presence of something or someone watching me. The attic door was still open, the music box still sitting in the center of the room. But now I couldn't bring myself to go back up there. I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. The next few nights were filled with strange sounds. The knocking would return, always from the same place in the attic, but I never went back up. I would stay in my room, curled up under the covers, too frightened to move. The footsteps in the snow remained, but no one ever appeared to make them. I left the cabin a week later, unable to shake the feeling that something or someone was still there. I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know one thing for sure. There was something in that house, and whatever it was, it didn't want me there. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The night the snowstorm hit, I had no idea how bad it would get. I had planned for a simple getaway, a weekend in a small cabin nestled in the mountains. I had been longing for solitude, a break from the noise of the city, and what better way to escape than with the quiet of nature surrounding me? The innkeeper, an older man with a face carved by time and weather, had warned me of the incoming storm when I checked in. "Don't go far, miss," he'd said, his voice gruff. "The storm's coming fast. You don't want to be out there when it hits." I had smiled politely and reassured him that I'd be fine. After all, I had experienced snowstorms before, nothing I couldn't handle. I was more concerned with a relaxing weekend than any weather forecast. That evening, the storm began creeping in, slowly at first, a few light flakes drifting from the sky. By the time I settled into the cabin, the wind had picked up and the snow had become relentless. The swirling winds pressed against the windows, their fury growing by the hour. I sat near the fireplace, curled up with a book, listening to the crackling of the fire and the howling winds outside. The storm felt isolating in a way that was almost comforting at first. I felt cut off from the world, cocooned in the warmth of the cabin. But as the night wore on, something felt off. The wind outside began to take on an almost unnatural quality, sounding too much like voices, whispers and moans in the swirling storm. I shook it off. The sound of the wind can do that to a person's mind, I thought. I returned my focus to my book. Around midnight, a strange tapping sound started. At first, I thought it was the wind, the branches of nearby trees scraping against the cabin. But then it came again, a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingers against glass. I set my book down, listening carefully. It was coming from the window near the front door. I stood up, curiosity mixing with a faint unease, and walked to the window. Peering out through the snow, I saw nothing but white, the storm swallowing everything outside. There was no figure, no one standing on the porch, just the swirling mass of snow, and yet the tapping continued. I stepped back from the window, unease turning into confusion. Who could possibly be out there in this storm? I closed the curtains, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. But then the tapping came again, this time from the side of the cabin. Soft, deliberate knocks. It was almost as if someone was walking around the house, tapping on every window. My heart began to race. I walked to the side door, pressed my ear to it, but heard nothing. The wind outside was now a full-on roar, and the storm had become an unrelenting whiteout. I glanced around the cabin, my breath quickening. Something felt wrong. My skin tingled as if I weren't alone, as if there was something in the house with me. I checked the locks, the windows. Everything was secure. Still, the tapping continued, circling the cabin, stopping at one window, then another. It felt like the house was alive, like the storm was no longer just weather, but something else. Something sinister. I tried to distract myself by lighting another log in the fire, but as I bent down to stoke the flames, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, slow, measured, as though someone were walking across the floorboards. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat, but the room was empty. Only the fire, flickering in the hearth. For a moment, I thought I might be imagining things. The isolation, the howling storm outside. Maybe they were getting to me. I walked to the living room and sank into the chair by the fire, my mind trying to rationalize it all. But as the minutes passed, the feeling of being watched never left. The air in the cabin grew colder, and the fire's warmth felt like it was retreating, leaving me exposed. Then, from somewhere deep in the cabin, down the hallway that led to the bedrooms, I heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Help me." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was so faint, I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, this time louder, clearer. "Help me." I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. Who was that? Was someone else in the cabin with me? Was there a stranger trapped in the storm? I didn't know, but I had to find out. I walked down the hallway, my feet heavy as if I were wading through thick mud. The storm outside seemed to roar even louder, as if the very air was pressing in on me. The hallway was dark, except for the faint glow of the firelight from the living room. The air was freezing now, far colder than it should have been, and I could see my breath in front of me. The voice came again, clearer now. It was coming from the end of the hall, from the spare room I hadn't even bothered to open. I reached for the door handle, but my hand faltered. The cold on the other side of the door seemed to leak through the wood itself. I turned the handle and opened the door slowly. The room was empty, but the air inside was deathly cold, so cold that it made my skin ache. And then I saw it. On the far side of the room, there was a figure standing, looking out the window. A woman dressed in an old-fashioned coat, the fabric torn and weathered. Her hair hung loosely around her shoulders, wild and tangled, as if she had been caught in the storm for a long time. She didn't turn when I entered. She didn't acknowledge me at all. She just stood there, staring out into the blinding white storm, her hands pressed to the window as though she was trying to see through the blizzard. I could feel the chill from the room seeping into my bones. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. But she didn't respond. She didn't even move. It was as if she didn't hear me. I took a step closer, my breath coming faster now, but just as I reached out to touch her shoulder, she turned. Her face was gaunt, hollow, and pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Help me," she whispered again. The room seemed to freeze, the air thickening as if the storm outside had found its way inside. I tried to speak, but my words caught in my throat, and before I could react, the figure was gone. The room was empty. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my breath shallow. The chill remained in the room, but the woman, if she had been a woman at all, was gone. I fled the room, running back down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I bolted the door behind me and rushed into the living room. The fire was still burning, but the warmth had fled, leaving me trembling in its absence. The tapping started again, louder this time, as if a dozen hands were drumming against the windows, each knock punctuated by the harsh wind. I closed my eyes, pressed my hands to my ears, but it was no use. The tapping, the whispers, the voice, it was all around me. I had to leave. I grabbed my coat, my boots, and rushed for the door that I praying it would open. But when I reached it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Through the window, I saw her, standing outside in the storm, her face pressed against the glass, staring at me with those wide, empty eyes. I opened the door, but the moment I stepped outside, the storm hit me with full force, and the figure disappeared into the blinding snow. I never found out who she was or why she was there. But I left the cabin that night, in the heart of the storm, and never returned. To this day, I can still hear the tapping in the wind, and sometimes, if the snow falls just right, I swear I can see her face in the blizzard. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The wind had begun to pick up around midday, just as I'd finished unpacking my things at the small, secluded cabin I had rented for the weekend. The cabin sat nestled at the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by towering pine trees. The snow had started falling lightly as I arrived, dusting the ground in a powdery layer. But now, as dusk approached, the storm had escalated. By evening, the wind was howling like a pack of wolves, and the snow was coming down in thick sheets, kind of swirling around the trees and blurring the landscape. I had no intention of going anywhere. My plan was simple: get away from the chaos of the city, spend some time reading, cooking simple meals, and enjoying the solitude. No phone calls, no interruptions. just me and the winter. The cabin itself was old but charming, with creaky floorboards and a wood-burning stove that crackled and popped as it warmed the small living room, the kind of place you'd expect to find in an old ghost story. I half expected to find a dusty old journal in one of the cabinets filled with tales of the past, and I smiled to myself at the thought. I had the cabin to myself, and the isolation was exactly what I needed. After a hearty dinner, I settled into an armchair in front of the fire with a book. The wind outside had picked up significantly, and the storm raged as if it were angry at the world. I couldn't help but feel a little thrill from being so far removed from everything. It felt like a perfect night. The wind rattled the windows, and the storm intensified. I couldn't hear much else, just the howling gusts and the occasional creak of the house. The fire crackled, and I was lost in the pages of my book. After some time, I glanced up at the clock. It was nearly 11 p.m. I yawned and stretched, planning to head to bed soon. But as I set my book down, I heard it. At first, I thought it was part of the storm, the wind knocking against the side of the cabin. But then I heard it again, a light tapping on the window. At first, I froze. It couldn't be the wind, could it? The tapping was too regular, too deliberate. I stood up slowly and moved toward the window. The storm outside had blurred the view, but I could see nothing but white. Nothing should have been out there in this weather. I opened the curtain a little, peering out into the swirling snow, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Nothing was visible in the blizzard. I must have been imagining it. But then it came again, this time from the side of the house, against the wall. 3 quick taps, then a pause, then 3 more. The rhythm was strange, unnerving. I glanced nervously around the room, trying to make sense of it. The storm howled louder, drowning out all other sounds. I walked to the door and checked the locks, just to reassure myself. Everything was secure. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, no surprise, really, given the remote location. The storm had cut off any possibility of communication with the outside world. I tried to brush off the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. The wind could make strange sounds, after all. But the tapping continued. It was persistent now, like someone was deliberately knocking at the house, trying to get my attention. I approached the door, slowly. The wind howled louder, and I held my breath, straining to listen. The tapping was now on the window directly in front of me, as if someone were standing right outside. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. The wind had completely died down for a moment, leaving only the eerie silence. The knocking continued. I opened the door. The cold hit me like a punch to the chest, but the air was still. The snow had fallen in thick layers, blanketing the ground, and there was no sign of anyone outside. Just the endless white stretching into the darkness. I stepped out cautiously, the storm swirling around me, but I saw no footprints in the snow, no trace of anyone at all. The tapping stopped. Confused and increasingly uneasy, I closed the door behind me and locked it again. I stood in the center of the room, trying to calm myself. But as I glanced back toward the window, I could have sworn I saw something. A shadow flicker past. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Just the storm. I tried to shake it off, but my hands were shaking. Something wasn't right. The fire was still crackling in the hearth, but the warmth it provided felt distant, like I wasn't fully in the room anymore. I went to the bathroom, splashing some cold water on my face, trying to steady myself. When I returned to the living room, the temperature had dropped. The fire was still burning, but the chill had crept in. I looked at the window again, but it was covered in condensation, and I couldn't see through it. I sat down, trying to read again, but I couldn't focus. The storm outside seemed louder now, more aggressive, the wind scratching against the walls as though it were clawing at the cabin to get in. I tried to ignore it, but the sensation of being watched, of something lingering just out of sight, kept gnawing at me. Suddenly, I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. It was the sound of a door creaking open. I leapt to my feet, panic rising in my chest. I'd checked every door and window earlier. There was no one else in the cabin, yet the sound was unmistakable. I cautiously walked to the hallway, my steps slow and deliberate. The door to the spare room was ajar, just a crack, and I had been certain it was closed earlier. I pushed it open, my breath coming in short gasps, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. The window was shut tight, the curtains drawn. Yet, the room felt colder, much colder than the rest of the house. I closed the door quickly, feeling a rush of dread flood over me. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't on the windows. It was coming from the walls, from somewhere deeper in the house. Each tap was like a hammer against my nerves. I stood frozen, the sound reverberating in the silence, louder now, coming closer. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there with me, just out of sight. I walked back toward the fireplace, my mind racing. Maybe it was a branch, maybe the storm had caused something to shift. Maybe. No, it wasn't possible. But as I reached the fireplace, I felt it. A cold draft, even colder than before, creeping in from the corners of the room. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and then in the reflection of the window, I saw her. A figure, standing just outside, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide open but unseeing, staring into the cabin. She was standing motionless, her clothes tattered, her hair wild and white as the snow. She didn't move, she just stood there looking at me through the glass. I stumbled back, my heart thundering in my chest. The room seemed to close in around me. I reached for the door, but the wind had picked up again, howling outside as if in response to my panic. The figure outside did not move. She simply stared, her face expressionless, her presence suffocating. I ran to the back door, throwing it open. The wind slapped me in the face, the snow blinding, but there was no sign of her. No footprints in the snow. The yard was empty, and the storm raged on as if nothing had happened. But inside, I could still feel her presence, her cold, empty eyes. I slammed the door shut, locking it, and backed away. The tapping began again. Not on the windows, not on the walls, but in the corner of the room, softly at first, then louder. A slow, deliberate knocking. "Help me," came a faint whisper, as cold as the wind. I ran. I didn't stop. The storm outside was nothing compared to the terror that gripped me inside that cabin. I bolted out the door into the freezing night, my heart pounding, and didn't look back until I reached the nearest town. The storm eventually died down, but I knew, deep down, that whatever was in that cabin would never leave. Story, the end.